The millionaire's twin daughters lived in silence until the humble nanny taught them to see the world with their hearts. But what the millionaire did next left everyone speechless. The wrought iron gates swung open with a reverent silence, as if the manor itself were holding its breath for its master's return. Richard stepped out of the car before the driver could open his door, his expensive coat slung over one shoulder, his mind still miles away in a Dubai boardroom where dollar figures and profit projections had been the only language for the last 48 hours. Coming home 2 days early was a luxury he rarely allowed himself, an impulse born from an exhaustion that not even the thunderous success of his new ventures could quell. He cut across the side entrance, opting for the stone path that snaked through the immaculate garden, an oasis of perfection designed by a renowned landscape architect. He expected the usual silence, the aseptic order that was the seal of his house, the refuge he had built to isolate himself from the chaos of the world and, perhaps, from himself. But what met him was not silence. It was a sound he almost didn't recognize, so alien and out of place in this controlled environment. Laughter. Not just any laughter. It was two laughs, intertwined like the notes of a forgotten melody, full of a pure, childlike joy that seemed to make the very leaves on the camellias vibrate. He stopped behind a boxwood hedge, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar force. And then he saw them, Laura and Beatrice, his daughters, the twins, the world knew only through whispers and distant photographs, were kneeling in the dirt, the damp, dark earth of the garden's most prized flower bed. Their small hands, which were meant to be perpetually clean, were plunged into the soil with a delight that left him breathless. Beside them, kneeling just as they were, was the new nanny, a simple-looking young woman whose name he barely remembered reading on the agency report. Elena. She was guiding the girls, hands one at a time, to small sprigs of plants. "This one," she was saying, her voice as serene as a prayer, "is lavender. Feel how the leaves are thin, almost like needles that don't prick. And the smell, it's the smell of calm." The girls inhaled deeply, their small, identical faces turned toward the sun and let out little squeals of discovery. "Now, the rosemary," the nanny continued, "stronger, bolder. It smells like something Grandma would cook for the holidays." Richard's shock wasn't about the scene itself, the dirt under their fingernails, or the white dresses stained with green. It was the sound, the laughter he hadn't heard in months. Perhaps not since their mother had left, leaving behind a void he had filled with rules, efficiency, and a fortune that grew in direct proportion to the joy that dwindled in his home. The head housekeeper, the strict and loyal Mrs. Gable, would never permit such disorder. That garden was a sanctuary, one of the many assets in his vast portfolio, and now it was being profaned by simplicity, by life in its purest form. Suddenly, Eleanor looked up, as if she felt the weight of his stare, and her face transformed. The serene smile vanished, replaced by a mask of panic. She froze, expecting the reprimand, the summary dismissal, the fury of the multimillionaire boss who measured the world in spreadsheets and results. But Richard didn't move. He remained silent, the leather briefcase slipping from his hand and landing on the grass with a dull thud. It was as if the world, with all its noise of stock markets and gold prices, was forcing him to listen to the only sound that truly mattered. The entire house, with its polished hallways that echoed with loneliness, its tall windows framing a perfect and untouched landscape, and the grand piano in the living room, closed for years like a tomb of memories, seemed to hold its breath along with him. In that instant, the fate of the four of them, bound by invisible threads of grief, guilt, and a desperate need for connection, began to be woven. He took a step forward, his tall shadow blanketing the three figures in the flower bed, and the girls' laughter ceased, cut short by the sudden tension that electrified the air. The silence that followed the thud of Richard's briefcase on the ground was denser than any the mansion had ever known. Laura and Beatrice, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmosphere, instinctively shrank back, their hands seeking the safety of Elena's dress. The nanny, in turn, rose slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands on the side of her skirt, her heart racing. She braced herself for the harsh words, for the dismissal that seemed inevitable. She carried the painful memory of a previous job lost for this very reason, for getting too involved, for treating a child with a disability like a child, not a problem to be managed. She had sworn to herself she wouldn't make the same mistake, that she would maintain the professional distance that would protect her. But how could one keep a distance from two souls so thirsty for the world? Richard, however, said nothing. He simply bent down, picked up his briefcase, and without looking at them, turned and walked into the house, his expensive shoes making almost no sound on the polished marble. The absence of a reprimand was somehow more terrifying than a shout. Later, in the library that smelled of leather and the old money that had funded every rare volume on the shelves, he summoned her. The air conditioning kept the room cool, impersonal. "Explain yourself," he said. His voice low and controlled, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her head. Elena took a deep breath, clasping her hands in front of her to still their trembling. "Sir, I noticed they respond to textures and smells with incredible precision. They were learning to differentiate the plants, to see with their hands and noses." Richard drummed his fingers on the solid mahogany desk, a gesture of impatience she recognized from business meetings. They have the best specialists, therapies that have cost a small fortune, none of which include dirt." The word came out with a restrained contempt. Elena felt a surge of courage. "With all due respect, sir, the dirt is real. The world is real. They don't need more isolation. They need tools to navigate what's out there." She spoke of her idea, still nascent, of a sensory map for the house. Chimes with distinct sounds on each door, cords with different textured beads to guide them along hallways, rugs that changed in texture to indicate direction. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, neither approving nor disapproving, leaving her in a limbo of uncertainty. In the hallway, however, she met a much more explicit obstacle. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was waiting for her with crossed arms and a stare that could freeze fire. "Listen to me, young lady," she hissed. "This house has an order, a routine. Mr. Richard built this sanctuary to protect those girls. Your job is to follow the rules, not invent new ones. Any deviation, no matter how small, will be reported to him." Mrs. Gable saw herself as the guardian not just of the house, but of her employer's fragile emotional balance, and Elena's arrival was a dangerous variable. Later, in the sunroom, Elena decided to risk a small experiment. It was 10 in the morning, and a strong sunbeam cut through the glass ceiling. She led the girls into the center of the beam of light. "What do you feel?" she asked softly. Beatrice lifted her face and smiled. "Yellow," she said. "It's a yellow warmth on my face," Laura agreed, laughing. "A warm, happy yellow." From a second-floor window, Richard was watching. He heard the laugh, saw the radiant faces turn toward a light they couldn't see but could feel. A knot formed in his throat, a mixture of hope and dread. He had already invested so much capital in experimental treatments, in promises of cures that had proven empty. Hope was dangerous terrain, an emotional investment he wasn't sure he could risk again. Was this glimpse of joy a beacon, or just another mirage? While he wrestled with his ghosts, Elena, feeling victorious from the small discovery, went to her room and began sketching the details of her sensory map in a notebook. She didn't notice the door opening silently, nor the shadow that fell across her shoulders. Mrs. Gable looked at the sketches, not as a plan for help, but as a conspiracy to turn her ordered world upside down. With a swift movement, She snatched the notebook from the desk and, without a word, turned and marched toward Richard's office, the book in her hands like irrefutable evidence of a crime. Richard sat in his Italian leather armchair, Elena's notebook open on the rosewood desk. Beside it, Mrs. Gable's impeccable report detailed the nanny's insolence and breach of protocol. To a woman who managed a staff of 12 and a household budget that surpassed that of many small companies, the notebook with its simple drawings and delicate notes was an affront, a symptom of chaos. Richard flipped through the pages. He saw the sketch of a wind chime for the porch. With the note, "Silver Sound," and "Path to Garden," he saw the drawing of a cord with different knots and wooden beads to be installed along the main hallway. Large knot, bedroom door, smooth bead, bathroom door. They were simple, almost childlike ideas, yet they were charged with a logic that he, a man who built his empire on systems and efficiency, could not ignore. He remembered his daughter's laughter, a sound that no expensive therapy, no renowned specialist had managed to coax from them in months. He glanced at the stock market charts on one of his monitors, saw his net worth climb, but felt a hollowness that no dividend could fill. The office door opened, and Dr. Albright walked in, exuding the confidence of a man accustomed to his opinions being treated as absolute truths. Young, ambitious, and with an impressive resume, he was Richard's latest and most expensive bet. "Richard, good news," he said, placing a presentation folder on the desk, partially covering Elena's notebook. "I spoke with the clinic in Zurich. They're willing to evaluate the girls for the experimental procedure. It's cutting-edge technology, a real chance, but they're very strict. They require a completely controlled environment for the next few months. No unforeseen stimuli, no changes in routine. We need to keep the variables to a minimum for the pre-op tests to be accurate." The doctor's gaze fell on the drawings. "What's this?" Richard closed the notebook. "Just some notes from the new nanny." Dr. Albright smiled condescendingly. "I see. Well, any domestic initiatives will have to be suspended, of course. The focus now must be purely clinical. We're talking about a massive investment, not just in money, but in hope. We can't risk it. While the men decided the girls' fate in terms of assets and liabilities, in the kitchen, a different kind of miracle was happening. Eleanor had noticed that the kitchen was a territory of fear for Laura and Beatrice. Sharp sounds, strong smells, the danger of the stove. She decided to start with the simplest thing. She placed a glass of warm milk with cinnamon on the marble countertop. The sweet, comforting aroma spread through the house. A silent invitation. Soon, two small figures appeared at the doorway, their noses twitching in the air like little radars. "It smells like a hug," Laura whispered. Elena smiled and guided them to the counter. "Today, we're going to learn how to crack eggs." She placed an egg in each of their hands. "Feel how it's smooth and cool. Now for the fun part." She took Beatrice's hand and helped her tap the egg lightly on the rim of a bowl. The sharp tap was followed by a silence of anticipation. "Now, use your thumbs to find the crack. That's it. And push inward." The sound of the shell breaking and the sensation of the egg white running through their fingers made the girls let out squeals of surprise and delight. They couldn't see the yellow yolk mixing with the transparent white, but they could hear the crack, feel the texture, and smell the promise of a cake. From the doorway, hidden in the shadows of the hall, Richard watched. He had been drawn by the smell of cinnamon, an aroma that instantly transported him to his grandmother's kitchen, to a childhood where wealth was measured in affection, not stocks. He saw his daughter's hands, once untouchable, now sticky with egg. He heard their genuine laughter, not over an expensive toy, but over a broken shell. It was a blow to his chest, a revelation so simple and profound it made him dizzy. He found himself torn between two worlds, the clinical, expensive, and uncertain promise sold by Dr. Albright, and the sensory, cheap, and immediate reality provided by Elena. It was the logic of his capital against the logic of his heart. He retreated to the library, the sound of laughter following him like a ghost. On the desk, the glossy folder from the Swiss clinic and the simple notebook from the nanny lay side by side, two possible futures for his daughters. The phone rang, the caller ID displaying Dr. Albright's name, likely calling to press for an answer, to secure the wire transfer of euros to the clinic. Richard looked at the brochure with its photos of sterile labs and then at the drawing of a wind chime. His hand hovered in the air, suspended between the promise of fixing his daughters and the chance of simply knowing them. The outside pressure began to seep through the impenetrable walls of the mansion. The decision about the experimental surgery in Zurich hung over Richard like a storm cloud, a choice that seemed to pit the cold logic of business against the warm intuition that Elena had awakened in him. To further complicate the scene, his image consultant, Monica, arrived for a meeting with the energy of a hurricane. Monica was the architect behind Richard's public image, the brilliant entrepreneur, the discreet philanthropist, the devoted father. She was planning the launch of a new line of sustainable investment funds, and the narrative had to be perfect. "Richard, darling," she said, kissing the air beside his cheek, "the campaign is looking magnificent. The centerpiece will be a profile of you in a major magazine. The working title is The Man Who Turns Hardship into Fortune. We'll focus on your resilience, your ability to overcome. A photo of you, here in the library, looking powerful, with a subtle caption about the personal challenges you face." Elena, who was passing through the hall with a tray of snacks for the girls, heard the phrase, and her blood ran cold. Laura and Beatrice's pain, their condition, was being turned into marketing material, a prop to polish their father's public image and increase his net worth. She saw the pain in Richard's eyes, a guilt he tried to hide under a mask of control, and understood that he, too, was a prisoner of that narrative. Monica continued, oblivious to the nanny's presence. "We need to ensure the girls remain invisible during this period. No photos, no appearances. They're a sensitive variable. The focus is you, your strength." The word invisible echoed in Elena's mind. Her girls, who were already invisible to the world of light, would also be erased from their own family's story for the sake of marketing. In that moment, a decision formed in her heart, a necessary transgression. She would not allow their lives to be reduced to a footnote in their father's success story. In the backyard, she found the twins sitting under the shade of a jasmine vine. The intense aroma of the white flowers perfumed the air. "Girls," Elena began, her voice gentle, "what do you think the color white is?" Beatrice thought for a moment. "White is the smell of jasmine. It's a morning smell, before the sun gets too strong," Laura added. "And white is the taste of plain milk, with no sugar." Eleanor led them to a small raspberry bush laden with fruit. She placed a berry in each of their mouths. "And red?" Laura clicked her tongue. "Red bites back. It's a taste that wakes up your mouth." It was then that Elena felt the weight of the contract she had signed. A strict clause, drafted by Richard's lawyers, forbade any unauthorized excursions from the property. Every outing, every appointment required formal approval. Changing the routine without the doctor's consent was grounds for immediate dismissal. But the idea of a world contained by the walls of that mansion, while another, vibrant and real, pulsed just outside, was unbearable. That night, Richard sat down at the piano. He hadn't opened it since his wife had left. The keys were dusty, the wood cold. His fingers, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, hesitated over the ivory. He played a chord, a C major, hesitant and melancholy. The sound was muffled, as if the instrument's very soul were asleep. From upstairs, he heard a sound Not words, but a tapping. Two small hands patting the wooden floor, offbeat, but in a clear attempt to follow the vibration they felt. A clumsy tenderness, a connection that passed through concrete and wood, and that opened a crack in his wounded pride. He played another chord, firmer this time, and the patting continued, a little faster. For the first time in years, the house didn't just feel like a collection of valuable assets, it felt like a home. On Saturday, the smell of funnel cake and roasted corn drifted up from the town and over the high walls of the estate. Elena made her decision. With her heart in her throat, she dressed the girls in their best dresses, got the double stroller and timing it with the security guards. Shift change, slipped out the service gate. It was the first time Laura and Beatrice had ever set foot on the sidewalk of their own street. The town's farmers' market was a symphony of chaos for the senses, the noise of the stalls, the vendors calling out their prices, the sizzle of dough hitting hot oil. Elena bought them fruit and let them touch, smell, and taste. "This is purple," she said, placing a ripe Concord grape in Beatrice's hand. "It's a smooth, sweet little ball." A man at a produce stand offered them a mint leaf. Laura sniffed it and laughed. "It tastes blue," she exclaimed, to the amusement of the vendor. What Eleanor didn't know was that across the street, a neighbor, who always saw the expensive cars coming and going from the mansion but never its residents, was filming the scene on his phone, enchanted by the poetry of the little girl describing the blue taste of mint. He posted the video to a local social media page with the caption, "The Little Gems of the Hilltop Manor, Discovering the World." Within hours, the tender, unassuming video began to spread like wildfire, a small wave of sweetness about to crash violently against the walls of Richard's life. The video went viral with the speed of a breaking stock market report, the image of the two girls. Until then, a mystery protected by Richard's fortune was now on thousands of screens. Laura's simple description of the blue taste of mint struck a chord with the local community, generating a wave of sympathy and curiosity. But for every like and heartwarming comment, a shockwave reverberated inside the mansion. The first to see it was Monica. She called Richard, her voice shrill with a mix of panic and fury. "Have you seen it? Have you seen what your irresponsible nanny has done? They're everywhere. This is a public relations disaster. My campaign, Richard, my narrative of resilience, has been contaminated by an amateur video from a farmer's market. It makes you look like you hide them, like you deprive them of the world." Every word was a sharp knife, twisting the guilt he already felt. For Monica, the exposure wasn't about the girls. It was about losing control of the Richard Montgomery brand, one of her most valuable intangible assets. Next, it was Dr. Albright's turn. He didn't yell. His anger was cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Unbelievable," he said over the phone, his voice like ice. "I demanded a controlled environment, and now they've been exposed to a myriad of unknown stimuli, germs, sounds, allergens. How can I guarantee the accuracy of the tests now? This excursion may have compromised months of work and a significant investment in equipment and preliminary consultations. This woman must be dismissed immediately." The pressure was immense. On one side, public image and the promise of a medical solution. On the other, the memory of his daughter's laughter. Richard felt cornered, torn between the silent gratitude he felt for Elena and the fury at the exposure she had caused. He summoned her to the formal dining room, a space they rarely used. Monica and Dr. Albright were already there, forming an impromptu tribunal. Mrs. Gable watched from the doorway, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. When Elena entered, the silence was heavy, thick with accusation. Richard was standing with his back to her, looking out the window. "I trusted you," he began, his voice low but vibrating with contained rage. "I ignored the warnings, I ignored protocol, because I saw I saw a difference in them, and you used that to expose me, to expose my daughters to ridicule." He turned, and his eyes flashing. "Did you have any idea of the risk, of the humiliation?" The reprimand, delivered in front of everyone, was brutal. The sound of silverware that Mrs. Gable began arranging on the table for dinner was aggressive, each clink of silver against porcelain punctuating Elena's humiliation. She tried to defend herself, to explain that her only intention was to give them a piece of the world, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of accusations. Laura and Beatrice, who had followed the nanny to the dining room door, heard the harsh tone in their father's voice and felt the tension in the air. Instinctively, they retreated into the darkness of the hallway, their small bodies trembling. The vibrant joy they had discovered at the market dissolved, replaced by the old, familiar fear. The house, which for a brief period had seemed to breathe, plunged back into its usual suffocating gloom. Elena was dismissed with a curt gesture from Richard. Devastated, she went up to her room, the tears she had held back finally streaming down her face. She would pack her things in the morning. She had failed again. She had mistaken a job for a feeling, and once again the result was loss. As she was folding her few clothes into her suitcase, the door opened. It was Mrs. Gable. Elena flinched, expecting the final blow. But the housekeeper didn't bring words of contempt. In her hands, she held a small bundle of yellowed envelopes, tied with a faded satin ribbon. "I should have given him these years ago," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice choked, the stiffness in her face finally cracking. "But I was afraid. Afraid the grief would consume him, afraid the house would fall apart. I was wrong. Protecting the rules isn't the same as protecting the people." She placed the envelopes in Eleanor's hands. They were letters written by Anne, Richard's late wife. The handwriting was elegant, but slightly shaky. Eleanor opened the first one and began to read. "My love, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer there to remind you. Don't let fear turn our home into a gilded cage. Our daughters are not made of glass. They need to feel the earth, the wind, the rain. Please, promise me you will teach them to see with their whole bodies." With every word, Elena's heart beat faster, and then, at the end of one letter, a sentence made her stop breathing. "My thanks to that young nurse on the night shift, Elena. Her kindness in the darkest hours gave me hope." A flashback hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. Years ago, as a newly certified nursing assistant, she had cared for a terminally ill patient. In the quiet of one pre-dawn morning, the woman, knowing she would not see her twin daughters grow up, made Elena promise that if life ever put her in the path of children who needed to feel the world, she would not hesitate. The handwriting, the story, the promise, it was her. The woman from the letters was the girl's mother. The promise she had made in a silent hospital corridor years ago had found its destination. The revelation landed on Eleanor with monumental weight. The promise whispered in a sterile hospital room. An act of compassion for a stranger was not an isolated event in her past, but the cornerstone of her present. She held Anne's letters as if they were a treasure map, a moral compass that redefined everything. Her connection to Laura and Beatrice was no longer mere professional chance, but the fulfillment of a destiny, a sacred oath. The humiliation from hours ago dissipated, replaced by a fierce clarity. She was no longer fighting just for a job or for her own pedagogical beliefs. She was fighting to honor a mother's last wish. The inheritance Anne had left her daughters was not made of stocks or property, but of words that cried out for life. Meanwhile, the mansion continued to be the stage for a silent battle. The market video, despite Monica's and Dr. Albright's fury, had an unexpected consequence. The principal of the special school the girls attended a few times a week, called Richard. The school's annual harvest festival was approaching, and inspired by the online buzz, she had an idea. "Mr. Montgomery," the principal said, her voice full of enthusiasm. as we would like to invite Laura and Beatrice for a very special role. Instead of being in the parade, they could go on stage and narrate, in their own words, how they imagined the colors of the festival banners, the bonfire, the costumes. It would be a moment of pure poetry, of true inclusion. The proposal was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a recognition of his daughter's unique perception. On the other, it was more exposure, more risk, exactly what his advisors had forbidden. Elena, armed with the strength of Anne's letters, went to find him. She found him on the veranda, looking out at the garden, his face pale in the moonlight. She didn't accuse him. She simply held out one of the letters. "I think you need to read this." Richard took the paper, recognizing the handwriting that haunted his dreams. He read it, and then read it again. Anne's words were a voice from the past, clear and resonant, echoing exactly what Elena had been trying to say. The plea not to isolate them, the appeal to teach them to see with their whole bodies. Guilt hit him like a wave, leaving him breathless. He hadn't been protecting his daughters. He had been betraying the promise he had made to his wife. The pressure, however, did not let up. Dr. Albright scheduled an urgent meeting for the next morning, bringing with him the authorization forms for the trip and the first payment invoice for the surgery, an astronomical sum in euros. "Richard, time is running out. The clinic needs a confirmation. It's the logical decision, an investment in their health with a lifelong return." At his side, Monica reinforced the argument. "Think of it as damage control. A trip abroad. A cutting-edge treatment. This completely erases the neglectful father image the market video might have created. We can sell this as a supreme act of love." Their words were seductive, appealing to the business mindset he had cultivated for decades, solving problems with money, guaranteeing results, controlling the variables. It was his comfort zone. The Harvest Festival, by comparison, seemed like a sentimental and unnecessary risk. He sat at his desk, pen in hand, the Zurich contract before him. A signature there would represent security, an action plan, a return to the world he understood. But before the ink could touch the paper, a sound reached him from the hallway. It was a murmur, faint and a little off-key, but unmistakable. Laura and Beatrice were humming. They were humming the simple melody he had played on the piano the other night. It wasn't a learned song, but a sonic memory, a vibration that had stayed with them and which they were now recreating with their own voices. That simple sound broke through the armor of logic and fear that enveloped him. He dropped the pen. The cash flow of his company, the price of Bitcoin, none of it mattered. What mattered was the fragile melody coming from the hallway. He stood up, leaving the doctor and the consultant speechless, and followed the sound. The girls were sitting on the floor near the open veranda door. A warm breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of roasted peanuts from the town square, where preparations for the festival were already underway. The smell of the real world. The smell of the world he had denied them. Richard walked to the kitchen, where Eleanor was putting away dishes, her face tense with expectation. He didn't say a word. He just went to the small key rack by the door, took the key to the main gate, and placed it in her hand. Eleanor looked at the key, then at his face, her eyes full of a silent question. "Show them what you promised," he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion he could barely contain. The town square was dressed for a party. Colorful banners fluttered in the wind, strung between lampposts and old trees, creating a vibrant ceiling against the evening sky. The smell of roasted peanuts, popcorn, and hot apple cider mingled in the air, an olfactory tapestry of pure joy. For Laura and Beatrice, it was sensory overload, but not in a frightening way. It was like diving into an ocean of life. Hand in hand with Elena, they walked slowly, their feet feeling the difference between the cobblestone paths and the patches of grass. Elena narrated their surroundings. "The banners are like paper laughter hanging in the sky," she said. Look, and the light from the lampposts is orange, a warmth that doesn't burn, like the smell of fresh cornbread. The girls absorbed every word, every sound, every scent, building the scene in their minds with a vividness no sight could surpass. The whole town seemed to be there, and when the school principal called the twins to the makeshift stage, a curious silence fell over the crowd. A microphone was adjusted to their height. For a moment, the silence felt too heavy, and Laura squeezed Beatrice's hand. Elena, kneeling beside the stage, and whispered, "Remember the jasmine, remember the mint." Beatrice took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," she said, her voice small but clear. "We don't see colors with our eyes, but we feel them." The crowd leaned forward, captivated. Laura continued, "Green tastes like wet grass and smells like a crushed leaf. It's a taste that makes you want to run." Beatrice took over again. "Yellow is the warmth of the sun on your face in the morning, and it's also the sound of popcorn popping in the pan. It's a happy sound." They took turns, describing a universe of sensations. Red was the sharp taste of a raspberry and the high-pitched sound of a whistle. Blue was the smell of mint and the feeling of cool water on your feet. And gold, Laura concluded with a smile, is the sound of corn roasting on the fire, a warm, crackling sound in our ears. When they finished, the square was silent for a second, and then erupted into thunderous, emotional applause. It wasn't applause of pity, but of admiration. The entire town, which had once seen them as the reclusive daughters of the billionaire, now saw them as poets. The new video, captured by dozens of cell phones, went even more viral than the first. But this time, the narrative was uncontrollable. It was no longer about the nanny, it was about the girls. Monica's reaction was apoplectic. "It's over. He's lost control. His image is now that of an exploitative father." She screamed into the phone at one of her assistants. Dr. Albright, feeling his influence and the multi-million-dollar contract slipping through his fingers, was more direct. He called Richard and threatened, "If you continue with this sentimental, anti-scientific approach, I am officially withdrawing from the case. You will be on your own." But the biggest surprise came from another direction. Richard's ex-fiancée, a socialite named Veronica, who had left him months after the girl's diagnosis, saw an opportunity in the event. She appeared at the mansion the next day, exuding expensive perfume and false concern. "Richard, darling, I saw what happened. So moving, but so risky. They need discipline. A firm hand. I could help. We could get back together. I could take over their care with the structure they need." Her proposal was clear. She wanted the fortune, the status, and she would use the girls as a shortcut to get it. The conflict reached its boiling point. Lawyers were called. An emergency hearing was scheduled to discuss visitation rights, the validity of Elena's contract, and above all, the authorization for the surgery in Zurich. The house, which had experienced a brief moment of harmony, became a legal and emotional battlefield. The girls' future would be decided not by scents and sounds, but by cold arguments and court filings. Richard felt the weight of his choices, the emotional capital he had invested in each decision, and feared that in the end he would be left with liabilities from which he could never recover. The courtroom was the opposite of the town square, cold, silent, and smelling of old paper and disinfectant. The air was heavy with formality and tension. On one side of the dark wood table sat Richard, flanked by a lawyer in an expensive suit. Beside him, yet seeming a universe apart, was Elena, in her simple dress and a calm that felt out of place. On the other side were Dr. Albright and Monica, representing logic and strategy. Veronica, the ex-fiancée, had strategically positioned herself on a bench just behind them, like a vulture awaiting its chance. The twins were not physically present, but their voices and laughter echoed in everyone's mind, the invisible center of the dispute. The judge, a middle-aged man with a weary but attentive gaze, asked Richard to state his position. The multimillionaire's voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing deals of astronomical figures, faltered. "Your Honor," he began, his voice hoarse, "and I have spent the last few years trying to fix my daughters. I invested in the best science, the best of my money. I built a perfect, safe world for them. But the truth is, I was building a prison." He paused, looking down at his own hands resting on the polished table. "I was afraid. I don't know how to love without guaranteeing results, without a plan, a target, a profit projection. If I couldn't give them sight, I would give them everything else my fortune could buy. But I wasn't giving them what they truly needed, the world. I admit my fear, and I admit my mistake." The silence in the room was broken by a choked sob. It was Mrs. Gable, called as a witness. She stood up, her face tear-streaked. In her hands were Anne's letters. "I have a confession to make," she said, her voice trembling. She told them about the letters she had hidden out of fear, out of a misguided loyalty. She handed them to the judge, who read them in silence, his expression softening with each page. When the floor was given to Elena, she didn't speak of pedagogical theories. She spoke of the smell of jasmine. "My fear," she said, looking directly at Richard, "is the dread of making a promise and losing again. I get attached, I build something, and then the world's rules take it away from me. But Laura and Beatrice taught me that the best things can't be taken away. The warmth of the sun, the sound of the rain, the taste of mint. No one can put that in a contract or take it away in a hearing." The most powerful moment, however, came from an unexpected source. Richard's lawyer presented a tablet. On it was a short video recorded the night before. Laura and Beatrice were sitting in the garden, and a court-appointed child psychologist was asking them what they wanted. The girls didn't talk about Switzerland or about seeing. Beatrice, in a serious voice, said, "We want to stay with the garden." Laura added, "And with Elena's map, and with Daddy's voice on the piano." The simplicity of the request disarmed all the legal complexity in the room. Just then, the courtroom door opened and a simple man, the head of the local neighborhood association, asked to speak. He talked about how the festival video had mobilized the community. "We don't want Mr. Montgomery's money," he said, "but we were inspired. Many of us have relatives with disabilities, elderly parents with difficulties. We want the knowledge. We propose creating an accessible community garden in the town square, with Elena's help and the city's support." The town, which had once seen the mansion as a fortress of unattainable wealth, now wanted to be a partner. The judge, visibly moved, banged his gavel. "Any decision regarding invasive medical procedures is postponed indefinitely. An independent, multidisciplinary team will evaluate the children in their current environment, respecting and monitoring the sensory plan developed by Miss Elena. The current living arrangements will be maintained." The sound of the gavel echoed like the final chord of a symphony. Dr. Albright and Monica gathered their papers, defeated. Veronica stood up and left without a backward glance. Richard didn't feel the triumph of a business victory. He felt the profound relief of someone who has chosen the right path, however difficult. He understood he had to choose between the image he projected and the bond he was building. The greatest investment of his life wasn't in stocks or crypto, but in his daughter's smiles. And for the first time, he felt the return would be infinite. The judge's decision wasn't an endpoint, but the beginning of a profound and irreversible transformation. Richard returned home, feeling that the air itself was different, lighter. The mansion, once a mausoleum of luxury and silence, was beginning to breathe. The first decision he made was radical and sent shockwaves through the financial world. He called a meeting with his company's board and announced he was selling a significant portion of his shares, enough to lose his controlling interest. "I need time," he explained to the stunned executives accustomed to his obsessive work ethic, My greatest asset is not in this company, it's at home, and I have neglected it for far too long. Part of the capital raised from the sale was used to liquidate a high-end real estate project that would have required him to send his daughters to an elite boarding school abroad, an idea Monica had championed as the definitive solution. He cut ties with her and Dr. Albright, paying their severance packages without a word of farewell. Instead, he did something no one expected. He hired a team of architects and designers specializing in accessibility and announced that the mansion and its grounds would become a pilot project, a reference center for sensory design. The tactile pathways Elena had only sketched in her notebook would now be built with fine materials, following the topography of the land. The garden would gain new plants, chosen not for their visual beauty, but for their diversity of scents and textures. He established a partnership with the neighborhood association and a foundation for the visually impaired, offering the space for workshops with local artisans, music lessons, and sensory gardening. The news spread, and what was once the fortress of a reclusive billionaire began to be seen as a beacon of hope and innovation. The community garden in the square, quietly funded by a trust he created, flourished with raised beds and braille plaques. None of this, however, was a fairy tale. The transition was difficult. Richard had to learn to delegate in his business and to be present at home. He found himself clumsy, unsure how to start a conversation with his daughters without the mediation of an expensive toy. He learned to sit on the floor, to listen to their descriptions of the world, to ask questions instead of giving orders. Elena, for her part, accepted the invitation to become the pedagogical director of the new project, but with conditions. "This house can't be allowed to devour anyone's heart," she told Richard. During a serious conversation in the kitchen as they prepared dinner together, "We need boundaries, work hours, days off, and most importantly, we need to talk about everything." She taught him how to apologize, not with gifts, but with words. And he, with his constant respectful presence, taught her to trust without fear of disappearing from the lives of those she loved. Their relationship grew slowly, like a seed in good soil, without the urgency of passion, but with the solidity of companionship and mutual respect. The days turned into weeks. The sound of the piano became a constant in the house, no longer melancholy but exploratory. Richard taught his daughters the colors of the notes. C was deep and dark like the earth. G was open and warm like midday. They would lay their hands on the piano's wood to feel the vibrations, laughing when the chords tickled their fingers. He discovered that Laura had perfect pitch, able to identify any note, and Beatrice had an impressive sense of rhythm. Music became their common language, the meeting point for their three worlds. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, blossomed in her new role. She organized the community events, welcomed families with a genuine smile, and in her spare time, she would sit in the garden with the girls, teaching them to weave palm fronds, a skill she had learned in her own childhood that the mansion's wealth had buried. The house was filled with sounds, smells, and people. Richard's net worth was no longer measured in dollars or the value of his assets, but in the number of laughs that echoed through the hallways. The net worth of his soul, he realized, was finally in the black. The last evening of the month arrived, a period that seemed to have condensed a lifetime of change. The sky was painted in shades of orange and violet, colors the Montgomery family had learned to describe in scents of tangerine and lavender. A warm breeze rose from the pavement after a quick summer shower, carrying with it the unmistakable aroma of wet earth and the distant sound of a fiddle from the town square, where the community was celebrating the success of the accessible garden's first harvest. That sound, once a strange noise from the outside world, was now the soundtrack to their new life. Richard sat at the piano, not out of habit or melancholy, but from a genuine desire to share. He didn't have to call his daughters. Feeling the familiar vibration travel through the wooden floor, Laura and Beatrice came running, no longer with their former hesitation, but with the confidence of those who know every inch of the path. They didn't sit beside him. Instead, they laid their hands on the piano's polished lid, closing their eyes to listen with their skin, feeling each note as a living pulse beneath their fingers. Elena entered the room silently, carrying a tray with 3 glasses of warm milk and cinnamon. She stopped near the curve of the piano, her body tense for an instant, a remnant of the old fear of being an intruder. Richard looked up and smiled at her, a smile that didn't aim to impress or seduce, but simply said, "Stay." And she stayed. She leaned beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, trembling slightly not from cold, but from the intensity of this hard-won moment of peace. He began to play a simple melody, a lullaby his grandmother used to sing. It was a tune that spoke of rivers, stars, and the cycle of life. The notes resonated through the room, no longer trapped in a sterile environment, but free, mingling with the smell of rain and the sound of the fiddle from outside. The investment in expensive therapists, the worries about inheritance and assets, the frantic search for a profit in the form of a cure, all of it seemed to belong to another life, to another man. In that instant, the final revelation settled in each of their hearts, not like a thunderclap, but like a sunrise, simple, gradual, and devastatingly beautiful. The love Elena had taught the girls for the things of the world, the texture of the earth, the scent of rosemary, the sound of the rain, had, in turn, and taught the adults to feel too. Richard Jess, the man who built an empire of money and business to shield himself from emotion, was relearning to feel joy in a piano chord. Elena, who protected herself from pain by keeping a professional distance, was relearning to feel the safety of belonging. And Mrs. Gable, who clung to rules to protect herself from chaos, was relearning to feel the warmth of community. The great treasure wasn't stored in vaults or invested in gold funds. It was right there, in that room, in the vibration of the wood, in the smell of cinnamon, in the presence of one another. When the last chord resonated and its echo dissolved into the air, the entire